Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today, we're going to follow up on our lesson on the revolutions of 1848 by introducing a whole bunch of new economic and political philosophies. Communism, utopian socialism, anarchism, all this fun stuff that arise in the aftermath of the failure of a lot of these groups to secure constitutions and lasting economic reforms in the revolutions that we talked about last time. So let's dive in, talk about previous movements to attempt to establish radical equality, and how these various movements differ both in their goals, their objectives, and in the end, the type of utopian society that they're attempting to create. So let's talk about the black and the red. Here are our objectives for today. Take a moment and make sure you understand them, and then we'll move on. We've seen previous attempts to try to create these radical utopias in the past. For example, in the midst of the English Civil War, we had the True Levelers, or the Diggers, attempting to argue that land ownership is theft and everyone should control the land equally. We hopefully remember that they went to dig and try to farm up on a hill in some public sort of what was considered wasteland at the time, until the local landlords got tired of them and the army kicked them out. During the English Civil War, very few people were willing to embrace a theory of radical equality like this, and so the Diggers became a historical footnote, although we do see them as some of the first who are attempting to lay out this philosophy. The conspiracy of equals within the French Revolution was another attempt to do this. Gracchus Babeuf, the tribune of the people, attempted to seize control of the revolution during the Directory phase of it, and establish again this system of radical equality, redistribute land, all that fun stuff. But again, he was crushed by forces both conservative and liberal who feared this type of radical distribution of property would, take away their property. Also, other problems. Here's the manifestation of the equals, arguing for land redistribution. So take a moment, pause, read it, answer questions, and then we'll move on. At this point, what people are starting to see is that both the Diggers and the conspiracy of equals, that in general the poor people are not unified enough to be able to rise up on their own. Poor people, and especially poor peasants, are generally conservative, are not particularly interested in all these fancy college-educated liberals showing up and telling them that their belief in religion is problematic and that they need to rise up and overthrow the social order, because in general the social order provides comfort to them. And so we start getting this philosophy of revolutionary vanguardism. Basically, the poor people aren't capable of recognizing their own interests. The peasants aren't capable of recognizing their own interests. And so what we need is a small group of committed revolutionaries who are going to rise up and overthrow the social order and then force the peasants to accept this new order, which eventually they'll realize is much better for them. So they don't right now know that this is in their best interest, so we're going to overthrow this whole thing for them and then push this radical change on them. This becomes a key component of a lot of these radical philosophies. Basically, the peasants are too backwards to help us, so we need to overthrow them as well in order to push forward this new order. And then in the aftermath, of course, they'll see how wonderful it is and support us. We also see the rise in the aftermath of 1848 of Karl Marx, who is a German revolutionary, and Friedrich Engels, who's the son of a wealthy British industrialist. These two guys get together in the aftermath of the failed revolutions of 1848 and start trying to write about what went wrong. And what they basically have decided is that history goes in this sort of pattern. And so these revolutions need to happen within places in which this pattern has gone. So we have this movement into bourgeois democracy. So the basic argument is before you can have a radical social revolution, you need to have this political revolution, have the bourgeois rise up, take charge, establish civil rights, establish equality, and then at that point, then the poor people can rise up, seize the means and relations of production, and destroy the sort of political and cultural institutions that have been holding them down, and then achieve true utopian equality in this era of communism. So you need to move past overthrowing the landed aristocracy, allow the capitalists to seize control of government for a while, and then they will create enough wealth that does not get redistributed that the poor people will eventually rise up and redistribute it. is the simplest version of historical materialism. I understand I'm glossing over a number of key points here, but this is the basic philosophy of Marxism, is that the exploitive nature of capitalism will eventually push the poor people to rise up and overthrow this, but you need a period of bourgeois capitalism first in this sort of historical progression before we're ready for this. So you can't just jump right from overthrowing an absolutist monarchy to utopian socialism. There's a series of key steps in between that have to be taken. Here's Friedrich Engels describing what this new social order will be like. So take a moment, pause, read, answer questions, and then we'll move on. This era of the poor people rising up is known as the dictatorship of the proletariat. And this often, because the word dictatorship is used, it's often misconstrued, but the basic meaning as they intended it is the many people finally having the say, rising up and taking control of the government, as opposed to what they argued under capitalism was the rule of the few, or, in the French Revolution, in the July Monarchy, the rule of the bankers. So it's the common people rising up and seizing control of society and redistributing the wealth more fairly. In general, Mikhail Bakunin was somewhat concerned about this because he was worried that the seizing of control of government is going to lead to slavery and brutality. And so he started arguing instead of the sort of state-sponsored communism, where the dictators, the proletariat need to seize control of the government, he instead argued that every individual needed to start ignoring the government and become equal. So by ignoring the government, by ignoring property requirements, and by forming these sort of small utopian communities, this is how we'd usher in the age of communism. And because power is somewhat abstract, if everyone at the same time basically starts ignoring the government, what power does the government have? If the people of the army no longer wish to serve in the army no longer exists, they can go back to their villages and live this perfect utopian anarchist socialism. So here's Bakunin's Revolutionary Catechism. I'll give you a moment to read this and answer the questions, and then we'll move on. In the end, all of these socialists tried to join together, forming the International Working Men's Association, which is supposed to be an international meeting of all of these different radicals of all these different countries to attempt to coordinate strategy to usher in the global worldwide socialist revolution. The International had somewhat of a structure to it in that they elected delegates and things like that, and the goal was they could coordinate their efforts and focus specifically on places in which they might be able to succeed in starting to establish this socialist paradise, this beachhead, which then socialism could spread to other countries as they saw how wonderful it was, and the common people rose up and said, wow, we definitely want to have what they have in that utopian socialist paradise. And so they would also rise up, overthrow their governments, and embrace whatever form of socialism that particular delegate pushed for. Here's your here's your song, the anthem of the International. So take a moment, read, answer questions. Pretty straightforward. In the end, the people who pushed for Marxist communism versus anarchist communism could not agree on the path to go forward. The communists in general wanted to push back against the political government in order to attempt to seize control of it. The question is, do we run our candidates for office? Do we try to get them in government and push for change? Or do we just totally ignore the government and start propagandizing to the common people to get them to support us? This divide between the Reds, as Karl Marx and his followers became known, and the Blacks, as Mikhail Bakunin and his followers became known, split the International in half and really prevented any type of unity or any type of centralized structure from being formed. And this ideological debate is really going to defeat and split the revolutionaries and make it really difficult for them to move forward in any concerted way. And so they both go ahead with their individual plans, but obviously with much less influence because they're splitting their efforts and to some degree working cross purposes. So here's the debate between these various group people. Here's Bakunin's take on Marx, Marx's take on Bakunin. So take a moment and read this. And then, of course, here's the conservative, Otto von Bismarck, who we're going to get very familiar with in about 2 lessons, basically arguing that since they're divided, they're really not that big of a threat to us right now. But if they ever unite together, if the common people can ever support one of these two things, it could be problematic for Europe. So, and then on the other hand, you get even more radicals. The Nerodists are going to basically try to push back against all of this. In the famous book What Is to Be Done, the Nerodists are going to start arguing that maybe none of this matters at all and we should just start living our perfect utopian lives right now. Maybe we don't need to redistribute property. Maybe we should just, go and live in these houses and try to reject society in general and push back against all of this. In Russia, especially, this was incredibly popular, and you got a whole bunch of young Russians acting, dressing, and behaving sort of the way that characters in this book behaved, as this became sort of the catechism for the revolutionary movement there. And some of these Nerodists started arguing that society was so corrupt that we need to just overthrow the social order without really having a sense of what's going to happen next. Because the social order, the political system that is established, is so oppressive that we can't even start to effectively educate the people in the various things they should be doing until we eliminate it. And so we start seeing the rise of terrorist groups like the People's Will, who are just going to strike against government officials, government offices, plant bombs, things like that. So take a moment and read the program of the People's Will. And so this is where we start getting revolutionary terrorism, which is going to become very popular in a bunch of different places, but especially in Russia. So when we get to Russia in about 4 lessons, keep in mind that's where this idea is coming from the Nerodists, who are attempting to just simply overthrow the social order so they can start pushing for change. So that brings us to the end of our various radical groups. Hopefully you can answer these questions in some detail, and when we come back, we'll return to nationalist movements attempting to create these nation states and unite these various disparate groups who have very different ideologies under the common banner of, well, we're all this certain nationality, so shouldn't we be able to unite together to form a national homeland? Thank you for listening.